All right, imagine this. You go to a property auction, you win, you pay the money, you get the deed. It's yours. Simple, right? Well, what if I told you a court could swoop in years later and just take it all away? That's not a hypothetical. Today we're digging into a real-life case that went all the way to India's Supreme Court, and it all boils down to one huge question: when is a done deal really done?
And that, right there, is the big question hanging over this entire story. I mean, can a court really do that? Can it step in and just completely unwind a finalized property auction, even after all the money's changed hands and the official sales certificate is issued? That is the high-stakes puzzle we're going to solve today.
Okay, so let's get into it. This whole thing started as a pretty standard financial deal, but boy, did it spiral out of control. To really get what happened, you need to know the three main players. First, you've got the borrower, a company named SARFAESI Constructions. Then there's the bank, in this case, Indian Bank. And finally, you have the auction purchaser, a guy named K. Sridhar, who, just thought he was buying a piece of property.
So here's how it all went down, step by step. Back in 2012, the company gets a loan from the bank. Pretty normal. But a few years later, they stop paying. They default. The bank then has to classify that loan as a non-performing asset, an NPA. That's just bank speak for a loan that's gone bad. So fast forward to early 2016, the bank says, all right, we're taking the property. A year after that, it goes up for an e-auction. And by March of 2017, the sale is done, the certificate is issued. Looks like case closed, right? Not even close.
I mean, the ink is barely even dry on that sales certificate, and the original borrower comes back and challenges the entire thing. And this is where the real legal fight kicks off. Their first stop, they take their case to the Debts Recovery Tribunal, the DRT, which is a special court set up for exactly these kinds of disputes.
So, what was the borrower's argument? It was pretty straightforward, actually. They basically said the bank's auction was totally illegal from the get-go, and the whole thing needed to be tossed out. Their whole case rested on two big claims. First, they said, hey, that property was agricultural land. Now that's a big deal because agricultural land gets special protection under a law called the SARFAESI Act. That's a law that lets banks do these quick auctions in the first place. So that was argument one. Argument two was simpler. They just claimed a bank didn't follow the proper procedures and timelines for the auction.
So, the DRT hears all this, and the big question is, what did they decide? Well, they came down on the side of the bank and the auction purchaser. The verdict was crystal clear. The sale is valid, period.
But here's where it gets really interesting, the why behind the DRT's decision. They said, look, the borrower showed us some old government records that say the land is agricultural, but they didn't provide a shred of evidence that anyone was actually, farming it. In fact, the bank even brought in pictures showing there was nothing growing, no agricultural work happening at all. So the court basically said, a piece of paper isn't enough. You gotta prove it.
Okay, so after losing that first round, the borrower does something pretty unconventional from a legal standpoint. Normally, you'd go to the next court up the ladder, an appellate tribunal. But nope, they decide to skip that step completely and leapfrog straight to the high court. They were clearly hoping for a different outcome, a more sympathetic hearing. And, well, look at this. Their gamble paid off big time. We see a complete 180-degree reversal. The High Court just totally flipped the DRT's decision on its head. Everything the DRT said was fine, the High Court said was not. They sided with the borrower on both of their main arguments, saying, yeah, the bank messed up the payment rules, and yeah, that land is agricultural.
And we need to be clear here. This wasn't just some small legal quibble. The High Court's decision completely nuked the entire transaction. It canceled the auction, it canceled the sale certificate. And just like that, the auction purchaser, well, he no longer owned the property. The done deal was officially undone.
But wait, it's not over yet. The bank, and of course the auction purchaser who just had his property pulled out from under him, they weren't about to give up. They decided to fight back. So they took their case to the very top, the highest court in the land, appealing to the Supreme Court of India to get a final answer, once and for all.
And the Supreme Court? They didn't mess around. Their judgment was fast and it was decisive. They said the High Court got it wrong. The original ruling from the DRT was the correct one. The sale was valid. And not just that, it had always been valid.
Okay, so what is going on here? Why this massive legal whiplash? What did the Supreme Court see that the High Court completely missed? Let's break down the two key legal arguments that finally put this whole thing to rest.
All right, first big question on the table. Did the auction purchaser actually pay on time? Remember, the High Court said he didn't, and that was a huge reason they canceled the sale. But was the High Court right about that?
So the rule for this, Rule 9, it's actually super clear. There are 2 steps. Step 1, you have to put down 25% of the price right away, either the same day as the sale or the next business day. Step 2, you've got to pay the rest, the other 75%, within 15 days after the sale is officially confirmed.
So the Supreme Court just did the math. The auction was February 17th. The 25% was paid the very next day, the 18th. So check. The bank confirmed the sale on March 8th. The buyer paid the remaining balance on March 23rd, which is exactly 15 days later. Check. The Supreme Court basically said, guys, the payments were perfectly on time. The High Court just read the rule wrong.
So that first issue was pretty much just about reading a calendar. Easy enough. But the second question, this one was much trickier and way more important. Was this property really agricultural land? Because if it was, it should never have been auctioned off like this in the first place.
And on this point, the Supreme Court was absolutely unequivocally clear. I want you to hear their exact words because this is the heart of it. They said, quote, "The classification of land in the revenue records as agricultural is not dispositive or conclusive." Basically, just because some old piece of paper in a government office says the land is agricultural, that doesn't automatically make it true in the eyes of the law.
So here's the bottom line. The legal standard the court laid down. What matters is the land's actual use when the loan was first taken out. That's the key. Was it being actively farmed to make a living? Or was it just a piece of land put up as collateral for a business loan? That's the real question.
And this slide shows you the biggest shift in legal thinking between the 2 courts. It's all about something called the burden of proof. Who has to prove their case? The High Court said it was the bank's job to prove the land wasn't agricultural. But the Supreme Court flipped that completely. They said, no, the burden of proof is on the borrower. If you're claiming it's agricultural land, you have to prove it. And as we already know, they just couldn't do that.
All right, so the sale is upheld, the auction purchaser gets to keep the property. But what does a case like this mean for the rest of us? What are the bigger lessons here? Let's zoom out and look at the broader implications for the legal system as a whole.
You can really boil it down to a few key takeaways. First, the Supreme Court sent a clear message. You can't just skip the proper legal steps because you don't like a ruling. Second, and this is huge for property law, what you're actually doing with the land matters more than what some old record says. Third, it hammered home a basic legal idea. He who asserts must prove. If you make a claim, you better be able to back it up. And finally, it's a stark reminder that when it comes to money and rules, you have to follow them to the letter.
And all of this leaves us with one last really big question to chew on. It's something this whole case forces us to think about. Where do we want our courts to draw the line? Should they stick strictly to the black and white rules on the page no matter what? Or should they have the flexibility to find an outcome that just feels more fair? It's that constant battle between the letter of the law and the spirit of justice, and it's something that sits at the very core of our legal system.